Hey there, it's Wayfair here, where delivery and setup are as easy as a few taps on your phone. You're relaxing in an old hammock, scrolling Wayfair's app, when you spot it, a brand new patio set. Next thing you know, Wayfair delivers it right to your patio and sets it up. Oh, you need a new grill too? All right, Wayfair's got you covered. With Wayfair's Room of Choice delivery and fast expert setup on qualifying orders, life gets a little easier. Visit wayfair.com or the Wayfair app.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
Coming up on the Threat Status podcast, we talk to Tara Murphy Dougherty, the CEO of Govini, a major defense software company. She takes us inside the advancing world of artificial intelligence and national security, and specifically the ways in which AI is reshaping logistics for the U.S. military, cutting resupply planning time, and just changing how the Pentagon does business. We've also got Washington Times national security correspondent John Seward on the show this week to walk us through some eye-opening new developments in the intersection between space and national security, particularly the concern that the U.S. may soon need a dramatic expansion in launch pad capacity for sending things into orbit. We'll also discuss the latest on the U.S.-Iran war, the prospects for a breakthrough in end-of-war negotiations, or a dangerous new escalation in the conflict. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm Guy Taylor, National Security Editor here at the Washington Times. I'm hosting this week's episode, which we are taping on the afternoon of May 7, 2026. National Security Correspondent Ben Wolfgang is away this week, but worry not. I've got John Seward with me. John is another of our top Threat Status correspondents. He covers national security, the growing intersection between advanced technology and defense and much more. John does amazing field reporting. He travels a lot. I'm psyched that you're here on this episode. John Seward, how's it going and what's on your radar right now?
Well, thanks for the warm welcome, Guy. I've been really focused on space lately. We came back from that time out in Colorado Springs at the Space Symposium, and since then the news has just continued to roll. We saw an announcement this week from Anduril Industries leading a team that includes a lot of different folks, including the Sandia National Laboratories, Voyager Space, K2 Space, a couple others, on a $3.2 billion combined award for space-based interceptors programs. This is going to be a big part of the Golden Dome that Space Force is trying to figure out. General Michael Gutlein said that this is the highest risk element, actually, of the program. So going to be watching out for how that goes. Anduril has made a big inroads into the defense market. They're a company based out of California. They bring very much this sort of Silicon Valley disruptor mindset and have taken on a lot of major contracts lately. And they seem to continue to do this exact sort of play with some of these contracts, which is to come in and be the team head for a lot of smaller companies, a lot like what we've seen some of our classic primes do in the past.
Whole other debate we could have about whether or not Anduril is the new prime or is becoming a prime level. It's such a new company to be lumped with Lockheed or RTX. But anyway,
100%. And they've climbed up the ranks of how much government money they're actually getting with these contracts very quickly. So very much approaching that prime territory. The other one from space, we had a great exclusive interview with NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman while we were there in Colorado Springs. And one of the topics that we talked to him about was actually the launch pad infrastructure that we have here in the United States. Lots of folks are very familiar with Cape Canaveral, with Kennedy Space Center. We also have a Space Force location in California. Those two locations, though, are basically everything that we have to be able to launch things up into space. And that's starting to be a bottleneck for all of the different civilian applications, but also national security applications that we've got going into space right now. A bunch of that is due to essentially SpaceX and Blue Origin being a lot of the folks providing launch and also being able to control a lot of what's going into that timeline. We talked to some folks in industry that said, they're having to plan a year out for stuff that right now they want to get launched. So that schedule really is starting to stack up. And when we talked to some former national security folks and officials, they said that schedule is very difficult because it's pretty easy to disrupt. Both of these places are on the coast. There's lots of things that can impact them. They're vulnerable to some of our adversaries because of their locations. And so this idea of getting more launch infrastructure in the United States is really starting to become an issue that the administration and that the community wants to see addressed.
So like Jared Isaacman, obviously great job. This was a couple of weeks ago. You produced this piece with our video team at Threat Status out of Colorado at the Space Symposium. Isaacman basically indicates that there is a lack of launch capability or launch pads. We need more than Cape Canaveral at Kennedy Space Center or Vandenberg. But has anybody else from the Trump administration indicated that there's any kind of a plan for this?
There's not a lot of discussion on the solution. There's more a lot of discussion on, oh, well, we need it, right? And that does come from the White House as well. We talked with, or rather, we saw Michael Kratsios, who's the director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. He effectively said, we've made a lot of progress on launch, but that it's not enough, that we need more launch capability. And, we tried to get down to brass tacks with Mr. Isaacman and say, well, what does that increased launchability actually look like, rather than just asking for more of it? And Isaacman was pretty straight. He said, we have another facility. There's a facility out here in Virginia that they've started to look at to upgrade to a launch facility, but that we need more.
Yeah, it's totally interesting, John. And I really hope listeners, if they haven't, will go and check out the video that you made with the NASA administrator, an exclusive piece, just great stuff. For my own part, I've been working closely with Washington Times journalists Vaughn Cocaine and Mike Glenn in recent days. Obviously, they're both members of the Threat Status team on our reporting of the just day-to-day developments in the ongoing U.S.-Iran war, and really the question of whether this conflict is about to spiral anew, or is it going to move towards some kind of a resolution anytime soon. As we taped this episode on May 7, officials in Pakistan who've been really key mediators between U.S. and Iranian officials in recent weeks were saying that they expect that there will be some kind of an announcement of a peace deal soon, maybe in the coming days. But the reality is that this war feels like a stalemate at this point, John. And even though it feels like it's a stalemate, it also feels like things could escalate. President Trump spent most of the past week openly threatening to carry out a new level of unprecedented bombing against Iran if Tehran does not accept the terms of a U.S. peace proposal that was delivered to Iranian officials in recent days. Of course, the exact details of that proposal have not been made public. So we don't know exactly what kind of dealings that Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, and other negotiators are putting in this proposal. However, our own sources say it hasn't changed dramatically since March, when negotiations appeared to be on the verge of a breakthrough, but then stalled. Remember, this war has actually been going on now since late February. And when it comes to the question of what really are Trump's demands, what are the U.S. demands on Iran, Trump has publicly and repeatedly demanded the end of Iran's nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs, a halt by Tehran of its support for such militant proxies as Hamas and Hezbollah, and the end of threats to shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. So for listeners tracking the moment to moment, my advice is to remember those key demands and ask yourself, are the Iranians really going to agree to any of that, let alone all of it? Or are they going to agree to something much more vague, in which case President Trump will likely try to declare victory and accept something much less than what he's publicly demanded? I don't mean to sound cynical here, John, or overly critical. I've just been covering this stuff for a long time, and I can sort of read the tea leaves and see where this is going. I also want to point out that the prospects for some sort of sudden Iranian acquiescence to U.S. demands it just feels unrealistic. I digress on all of this for now. There is one other thing though on the Iran file that I want to get at, which is this increased role that's now being played by China. China is Iran's strategic partner. They inked a strategic partnership in recent years. It is the leading consumer of Iranian crude oil, and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi hosted his Iranian counterpart Abbas Araghchi for talks in Beijing on May 5th, just a couple days ago. The Chinese at that meeting called for the U.S. and Iran to reach an agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz as soon as possible. Obviously, Iranian oil and Gulf Arab oil had been flowing through the strait prior to the onset of this war. China's desire to influence the direction of the conflict now is important and interesting, John, especially ahead of the much anticipated summit between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Donald Trump that is now planned for May 14 and 15 in Beijing. We will obviously be closely covering that in the Threat Status newsletter. But right now, I want to move toward our feature interview for this week. John, you and Ben Wolfgang sat down with Tara Murphy Dougherty, the CEO of Govini. And just a reminder to listeners, you will be hearing Ben Wolfgang on the interview segment as it was taped just before he went away for this week.
And we are joined now by Tara Murphy Dougherty, the CEO of Govini, a major defense software company and one that's really become a pretty major player here in the defense tech space, especially around AI, which we will talk about later today quite a bit during this interview. Tara worked at Palantir, served as Chief of Staff for Global Strategic Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and has held a number of other prominent roles. And she's our guest here today on the Threat Status podcast. Tara, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be on Threat Status.
Of course. Well, thank you. So we're going to talk a lot today about Govini and especially your ARC program. I know John Seward, my co-host here today, is really eager to get down into the weeds on some of that because our audience does appreciate that sort of discussion. So we'll get there in just a minute. But I did want to start with a couple of bigger picture questions right now about kind of the state of the U.S. defense industry, the defense industrial base, and then specifically where it's going. I'm just curious from where you sit at Govini. Has the U.S.-Iran war and before that, the massive amounts of U.S. military aid to Ukraine and Israel, for example, has that exposed some underlying problems that need to be addressed? From your vantage point, what are they, if so?
The major thing that these military operations have illuminated is the fact that demand for American military power all around the world continues to increase. And that is one of those truisms that all of us in the national security community have known and we feel. And now we see with Operation Epic Fury, for example, actual numbers being put against that demand. We see unbelievably high numbers of munitions being expended. We see legacy fleets putting in massive numbers of operations and flight hours. And so it really is quantifying something that is otherwise a continuing trend.
I'm curious what you think, even more specifically about the defense secretary and the arsenal of freedom push, this overarching, really kind of ambitious plan to overhaul requirements, acquisition, procurement, how new weapons and capabilities are developed and eventually fielded. Do you think this is going to work, or is there a fear that this is kind of just rearranging deck chairs? I mean, I don't need to tell you, you've been in this space for a while, that there's a lot of bureaucracy inside the Pentagon, and it can be awfully difficult to overcome when you're talking about changes on a scale like this. So A, do you think it could potentially work and get to where the secretary and this administration wants to go? And then B, if so, how does Govini potentially fit into all of that and maybe benefit from it?
It can definitely work. In fact, it is already working. I absolutely love what is happening in this moment. And you're right, it's not a new topic. The idea of acquisition reform, the idea of better supporting the development of modernization programs in the military, these are things that we've been talking about in DC and in national security circles for more than a decade, since DIUX was launched in 2015. And what is so exciting about the arsenal of freedom and the changes that are happening right now is that real action is being put against all of the narrative and dialogue and discourse that we've had for the past 10 years. I think the changes really started happening with the November speech, where Secretary Hegseth said to CEOs and PAEs, this is an acquisition warfighting system, no longer a back office function. And that was the moment that everyone realized there is irreversible momentum in the way that the executive branch, the White House, and even Congress, with some of the language we've seen in the NDAA, are putting real, as I mentioned, action behind these initiatives.
Yeah, for a company like Govini, a relatively newcomer on the scene when compared to some of the quote unquote primes that have been around forever. When you hear the secretary tell the primes, you guys have to change and evolve, or you're going to get left behind and potentially fade away as part of this broader U.S. defense industrial base. Do you welcome that message? Do you see those companies as rivals or standing in the way, or are you all partners in a sort of broader initiative here? What goes through your mind when you hear sort of some of those traditional players kind of singled out in this way?
Oh yes, Ben, we're all singing "Kumbaya" and holding hands. Can't you tell?
Could we be so naive? Yes, of course.
Exactly. Right. I do see both defense tech and the primes as an and. I do not see a world where the company, for example, that built us the stealthy 5th generation fighter, which is the most capable aircraft the world has ever seen, all of a sudden goes away. I do think what the primes have lost the bubble on is the way the market has changed in a way that encompasses defense and national security, and also that defense tech companies, certainly Govini included, we have delivered for the customer and worked with the customer through an operating model that has gained customer support and affinity. And I think the primes have alienated their customers. It's a fascinating area, and we have to find ways to work through this as a national security sector, because at the end of the day, it does have to be both. We need new capabilities like the software that you get through ARC with AI native, platform to be able to do amazing things. We need attritable systems that are going to allow the Department of War to use autonomy at scale. And we need power projection capabilities like aircraft carriers and fighter jets and stealthy bombers.
Tara, I want to cut in because you sort of said it as a yes and I think it comes off to a lot of folks that are in the national security space that is absolutely the case right now, right? You're not, as you put it, you're not going to see these large, heavy equipment, essentially wheels of war type defense manufacturers suddenly go away. Those pieces of equipment are still going to be needed for any sort of power projection, as you put it. But I do want to ask about the software side, because I know that's y'all's bread and butter. I grew up being told experts in warfare focus on logistics, right? That the tactics will take care of themselves if you can get everything where it needs to go. Tell me a little bit about ARC and about like how you guys are actually shifting some of the way that logistics fight gets fought and worked through by integrating AI.
Yes. Well, you hit on some of these key topics that get at why ARC exists and, frankly, why Govini exists. So we built an AI native platform that brings essential data about military capabilities, their components and parts, their suppliers, financial and capital flows around them, to the Department of War to specifically serve essentially 4 communities of users. And there are 4 communities of users that have largely been ignored in the past when it comes to giving the people who support these missions great technology, especially software, to do their jobs. And those communities are acquisition, logistics, sustainment, and maintenance. The reality is, if those four groups don't have great software, the data they need, and today AI, they can't execute the life cycle and manage the entire value chain of a weapon system or platform effectively. That's where all our readiness problems come from. And at the end of the day, that's the outcome that Govini's trying to change.
Right. Like I can't even tell you how many different spreadsheets got filled out and that was the master thing that got sent up to levels above reality, right? Of telling folks where we were on maintenance, where we were with beans and bullets, et cetera, et cetera. So no, it absolutely point taken that like it's a massive upgrade for those communities. I want to ask though, one of the things that we've heard is essentially that it's taking a lot of the resupply patterns, the ways that you do logistics, and shortening that time cycle. We heard about like 36 hours down to an hour, 97% reductions in effectively like how much time folks are taking to do this. How are y'all validating those numbers to the government to show that positive outcome, to show that value to them as a customer, and kind of convince Congress that this is the right direction to go in terms of software as a service and y'all's value to the department?
We let the government users validate those numbers themselves by working hand in hand with them. And I'll give you an example that ties into the logistics use case, because you're exactly right, John. The application of AI in logistics is just such a perfect fit, where so much of the goal is reinstating combat power on the battlefield. And the way to get there are by being able to model things and make decisions and input and change variables in order to determine plans, all of which can be done at decision speed now, as opposed to manually, which it has been done before. So, for example, one area in which Govini's plugged into next generation logistics is with the Army's next generation command and control program. And we are deployed at 4th Infantry Division out of Fort Carson, and our teams are there 7 days a week with the soldiers iterating on these workflows. And it's not just it's like in our PAE world and the Pentagon world, it's from spreadsheet to software, not so out on the battlefield. This is literally replacing whiteboards and cardboard in the back of the truck and grease pencil and paper, and moving to lightning speed models and AI planning. And so that validation is the difference between the before and the after.
You kind of stole my thunder. I was going to ask about that because I met some of the Govini ARC folks when I was out in Colorado with the Ivy Division. One of the things that struck me while I was out there, especially since you've kind of brought up this idea of like replacing the grease pen and the whiteboards, which were absolutely the system of record, which is wild. The big hump while I was there seemed to be, how do we get all of this information into the system, right? Like, what are we providing to the soldier that's useful to input all of this information? How has that gone, kind of getting down into the dirt at the tactical level for you guys? And how's the overcoming that friction been going to create this data environment?
It has been one of the hardest parts of the program, to be sure. And Next Gen C2 would not be where it is if it were not for unbelievable Army leadership saying, we are going to break down the bureaucratic barriers that exist to data access and data sharing, because at the end of the day, command and control depends on it. And if you are going to transform functions like logistics and sustainment into direct warfighting functions, which they are in reality and need to be reflected in data access and software software on the battlefield, then those barriers have to be broken down and the data integration challenge has to be overcome. So we have worked together with the Army and our other partners on the Next Gen C2 program significantly in this area to make progress. And one of the reasons it's so important from the Govini lens is, unlike many of our partners in this space, we are not just deploying ARC on the battlefield, but it's also deployed at the enterprise level. And this is what makes us so different and so important in this space is we are collecting data down at the brigade level and working with the soldiers, but we are also supporting the maintainer back at the depot and the program office who's talking to the prime about those production needs. And that's what closing the feedback loop looks like. That is quite literally how you connect to the factory of the fight. And we're implementing it in NGC2.
Okay. Tara, I want to not to do too hard of a pivot here, but I think you're in a really unique position to potentially answer this question, a broader question about AI. And I'm just curious whether you see any danger of, whether you want to call it a bubble or some sort of estimation of what AI is going to do. I think it was back in October or sometime late last year, you said that, quote, we're going to hire like crazy, unquote, in terms of AI talent, data talent, engineering talent. So one, have you done that? And I'm curious if you still think that's the right approach, because when we dig into this, I just can't help but wonder in the back of my mind, is there any chance whatsoever that in 2, 3, 5, whatever years, we look back on this and say, yes, AI definitely changed a lot, but maybe didn't reshape global workforces and business and basic ways that an organization like DoD operates quite as much as we expected? Do you think that's remotely possible, or has that train kind of left the station in your view?
I think that train has left the station, and I do think there will be a massive refactor in many parts of our lives because of AI. The one thing that I feel confident, maybe the only thing I feel confident in this space, is that we just don't have any idea what that's going to look like. And Govini, and from a leadership perspective, as I look at all of the benefits that AI can bring to our company, our product, and our workforce today, I don't see or have visibility to a single job that could be replaced. A human's out the door and an agent is in. Not yet. But what we are doing, in addition to continuing to hire like crazy, is we are using AI to accelerate what we're doing to drive better performance in the company. And most importantly, we are still first and foremost thinking about the application of AI in ARC to deliver value to our users. So over the longer term, I do not think that we will end up hiring as many people as I would have projected a year ago, and certainly not as many people as I would have projected 2 years ago. But today, we still are growing a lot as a company. And like I said, looking at AI as a mechanism to accelerate and improve what we're delivering.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it sounds like, as you described that, it sits in more of the enabler space still, and not the replacement space. You still need quite a few experts, quite a few operators to actually get the work done, but that it's multiplying what they're able to do.
So much of what ARC is about is its purpose-built nature for this vertical, the acquisition community, the logisticians, the sustainers, and the maintainers. And that last mile is so full of important workflows and details. And so, yes, we want people who are engaged with the users leveraging AI to continue to develop against that particular area that requires not just a security clearance to get into the SCIF and an accreditation on your platform, but also an understanding of the domain in a really meaningful way. And so, like I said, I have no idea what the impact is over the longer term, other than it will be revolutionary. We're excited for it at Govini. And in the meantime, we're just going to go faster.
Tara Murphy Dougherty, the CEO of Govini. Thanks so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Pretty interesting stuff there with Tara Murphy Dougherty of Govini on this week's featured interview. One exciting update now before we get to our special Threat of the Week segment. Remember that Threat Status will be hosting Indo-Pac 2026 Naval Dominance, Shipbuilding, Autonomy, and Command and Control, a special forum event with panels and keynote speakers, fireside chats, U.S. lawmakers, Trump administration officials, and defense industry leaders, all gathering at the U.S. Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C. for that Threat Status event in June. Find details at www.washingtontimes.com. And it is time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here on the show where we identify a global security threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world. It could be geopolitical, it could be technical, it could be philosophical. The point is, it's a threat that we think is impacting or could impact U.S. national security. John, what do you have as your Threat of the Week?
So, Guy, you mentioned it earlier in the podcast, right? But it's this comparison between rhetoric and reality. We're seeing it right now when it comes to the Iran conflict, right? You already outlined some of this, but this idea that the White House is declaring hostilities over, but the Navy is very much still involved in a blockade, that, they're saying that the war powers resolution clock has expired, but there's no real interaction with Congress other than to say, hey, the conflict's over. And we're seeing that in other ways as well. I mean, Russia has sort of shifted its policies around Ukraine, and it's putting a lot more sabotage and subterfuge pressure on European nations. Those nations are having to deal with this in their backyard, right? If you look at the Middle East, like, this conflict is actually happening. It feels very far away for folks here in the United States, but it is a real thing that is going on that people are having to deal with. And when you compare the rhetoric that is coming out of not just the administration, but kind of the whole establishment, it doesn't always match with what's happening on the ground. And I think that dissonance between those two things is my Threat of the Week.
Interesting. My own Threat of the Week also draws from the ongoing Mideast war, a war that continues dangerously to result in rising fuel prices around the world, especially among smaller nations in the Indo-Pacific region. Places like Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, countries that sit in the balance between aligning with the U.S. or aligning with China. And my Threat of the Week is that the energy crunch on these key industrial countries, most of them democracies, is giving China leverage over the United States as these countries look to China for help. It's giving Beijing influence that the Chinese have longed to have over the U.S. in the region. So my threat is that U.S. influence in the Indo-Pacific is at risk because of this war with Iran in the Middle East. And with that, a huge thanks to you, John Seward, for joining me on the show this week. And an even bigger thanks to Tara Murphy Dougherty, the CEO of Govini, for being the featured interviewee on this week's episode. And the biggest thanks of all to you, our listeners. Please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, share the podcast with all of your friends. I'm Guy Taylor. Thanks so much again from the entire team here at the Threat Status Podcast.